Hi, my name is Sam Tato. I'm a freelance 3D artist. In this video, I'm going to give a quick start to show how to use the animated condensation rig I built. If you don't know what that is, you can find a link to the promo and the product in the description below. When you download the rig, you're going to get this zip file. So go ahead and unzip it, and then open up the folder, and you're going to see three files. You're going to see the manual and two C4D files. One's going to be for Redshift, and the other one is exactly the same, but it doesn't have the Redshift materials and the Redshift tags. So I'm going to go ahead and open up the standard one, and this is the one that you can use for all other renderers. When you open up this file, you should see a cube and the rig. And to be clear, this is essentially an X-Particles system that I built with custom controls, so you will need to have a license for X-Particles to use it. This is the X-Particles hierarchy here. It looks like a lot, but you really won't need to go into this hierarchy except for when you're caching. Most of the functionality is in the controls that I set up here, but with the cache object, there's just too many options to fit into the control panel, so you will need to go into the cache object when you're ready to do your caching. So I'm going to disable kinetic droplets for now, just so we can focus on what's happening with the static droplets. I'll also turn off consider slope and the mesher. We just don't need those right now when the kinetic droplets aren't on. So with the static droplets, I'll just hit play and see what happens. So you can see that the droplets are populating over our cube. It knows to use the cube because we have it dropped in the spawn object here. You can drop any object you want in there. It can be parametric or it can be a hierarchy of objects. If I just turn off the materials, you'll see the geometry that's here. This is spawning actual geometry using a generator. If you don't want to use that, you don't have to. You can turn off drop generator, and then you'll just see the particles, and they're using whatever display mode that you have set here. So if we look at the controls, we have an enabled switch here. This turns the static droplets on or off. Then we have the amount. This is the total amount of particles that are going to be spawned. It's not an exact number because it's also fighting with the circle packer. The circle packer is making sure that none of the particles are allowed to overlap. So if you run out of space and this is a high number, then you might not actually reach that number. Next, we have the max and min radius settings. I'm going to open up the material that controls this. It's in the XP static droplet distribution material. The max and min particle radius sizes are controlled by whatever texture you have in the color channel here. By default, I have a noise in there plugged into a colorizer, but you can change that to be whatever you want it to be. I'm going to put the material on the cube, and then I'm also going to boost the amount of particles here so you can better visualize what's happening. That's too many. Let me go back. So if I turn off the luminance channel for now, you can see that wherever the black areas are going to be the smallest radius, and then wherever the white areas are going to be the max radius. You can probably better visualize this if I put it on a plane. So let me put a plane in here, set that to Z-, and then make it generally the same scale. So if I go back, turn off this cube, and plug in the plane, and I'm also going to drop this here. Let's do something simpler. I'm going to lower the amount to just 2,000 particles, and I'll just throw in a gradient. So you can see here it's white on the left, black on the right, and then you have the max radius going down to the minimum radius. So another good thing to show is that the luminance channel is controlling the amount of particles you missed. So generally what you want is to have less particles where the larger ones are, and then more particles on the right where the smaller ones are, to fill in the gaps. So usually what I like to do is take the same map that you're using for radius and copy it over to the luminance channel, and then just invert it. You can do that. You can do it with a colorizer too. And then we'll see how that looks. but you don't want 0 over here where there's black. So let's just colorize that to be maybe 50%. And then let me turn up the amount so you can see it better. So there you can see less particles emitted over here and then more particles over here. That way everything fills in the gaps where there's smaller particles and you're not left with too many large ones and then large gaps over here where the small ones are. So we also have the minimum separation value. As I mentioned before, the system uses Circle Packer to make sure that the particles don't intersect. This minimum separation value is going to be the minimum space allowed between particles. If you think the particles are getting too close, you can generally turn this up. So let's just take a look at this gap here and see if it increases. So I'll put it at just something much larger to 0.01. And then you can see the gap is much further than before. Another setting I skipped over is overall scale. Sometimes you're working at a smaller scale and you get an object and maybe it's much larger and you don't want to change all the settings in here. So as opposed to changing all your max size and your min size and separation and everything down here, you can just instead change the overall scale and that will multiply across every single setting. So for example, let's do the overall scale to 10. And there you can see everything just gets much larger, or we can do it much smaller. We can do 0.2. This will be tiny. And one thing to note is that everything will look the same. So if you have this, so like we have a plane here at, let's just do easy math, 10 by 10. And then we'll do another plane, move it over. I'll make that one 100 by 100. And then we'll make another system by just copying and pasting. And then we'll put the second plane in here. And then change the overall scale to a multiple of 10. There you can see this plane looks exactly the same as this plane, just at a different scale. So starting from a fresh scene here, I'll now show you the kinetic droplets. For now, I'll just turn off the static droplets and the drop generator. If I just hit play, we'll see what happens automatically, and you're going to see various droplets populating over the object. Right now the mesher's on. We're not going to need that just to visualize, so I'll turn that off, and that'll help speed up things when in the viewport. I'm also going to turn up the amount on the birth rate just so we can see more. So you'll see that right now they're spawning everywhere. That's controlled in here, the XP kinetic droplet distribution. If you go in there and open up the luminance channel, this texture here is going to control where they spawn. You can put something in here if you want to more specifically define where the droplets should be spawned. I just have a white by default, and so that means it's just going to spawn everywhere. I have a checkbox here, consider slope. Basically what that's going to do is look at the slope of the object and make sure that no kinetic particles are going to spawn on surfaces that are too flat. That way you don't have particles that are moving across a flat surface in an unrealistic way. If I just turn that off, you'll see what I mean. So like here we have one that's moving across the surface even though it shouldn't, because if it's on a flat surface it shouldn't be affected by gravity. So what I have is, if you turn on consider slope, I will show these emitters. so you can visualize what's happening. Basically, I have slope emitters emitting on parts of the object that are flat. And so once the kinetic droplets come into contact with these particles, they'll shrink out and die. So we'll look at this one here. So it hits and it shrinks and it goes away. That way you don't have those unrealistic particles moving around the flat surfaces. This does sometimes slow things down, so if you're just visualizing the general motion and distribution of droplets, I'd turn that off. And that way you can work faster around the viewport and get your motion and the amount and the size all working well. And then when you're ready to cache it, or if you want to just view it without the ones on the slope, then you can go ahead and turn that on. It just helps speed things up if you look dev it without consider slope on. So let me turn those back off. Well, the visual of it. And then next up we have droplet radius. That's going to be this green one here. That's the radius of that particle. And then the stream behind it kind of follows that size. Birth rate, again, self-explanatory. It's just the amount per second that are going to spawn on the object. Birth rate variation, that'll add some randomness to it. Lifespan is 100. So from the second it's made until the frame that it ends, it's going to be 100 frames with a variation of 50 frames, plus or minus. So some will have a lifespan of 50 frames, whereas others will have a lifespan of 150 frames, and then everything in between. Droplet max speed, again, this is just a range where some will move at 15 centimeters, some will move at a minimum of 3. You don't really want to put this down to 0, otherwise some are just gonna spawn and sit there. You can see this one here is almost doing that, but it's moving very slowly. So generally I like to keep this relative to the max speed just a little higher than 0. Then we have trail decay rate. The decay rate is how fast these streaming particles shrink down. So if we set that to something much larger, like 20%, they're going to shrink down much faster. Then you get a much shorter trail. And then if you want longer trails, you do the opposite and do something smaller, maybe 2%. And then you're going to have a really long trail on it. Leftover birth rate. So the leftovers are, I'll show you here. Actually, you know what? I'll set this to something high so those go away, and then you can see the leftovers. The leftovers are the red ones here. That's meant to emulate the effect of the droplet going down and then leaving something behind due to surface tension. And so you can increase or decrease the birth rate here if you want more or less of those. And again, you have the display here. So if you don't want to see spheres, maybe you want to see something that renders a little faster, you can just do circles. But I like to keep it on spheres because it gives you a better visualization of it. Okay, and then you also have the mesher. So this is what's actually rendered on the kinetic droplet, is the mesher. So when you're ready and you have your system all figured out, the motion's looking good, then I go ahead and I turn on the mesher, and that way you get the geometry, and then you can cache that and then render it. Let me just set this to dots. And let me turn off the materials so you can see the mesher. This is what's actually going to be rendered. So this setting just disables and enables the mesher when you're ready for it. I don't like to keep it on when I'm working on the motion because, again, it'll slow things down. So you just want to keep that off while you're working, figure out the motion, the distribution, and then turn it on when you're ready to cache it. So starting back at the default file again, let's say you're perfectly happy with your scene and you want to cache it so that you can go ahead and render, or maybe you want to export an Alembic or something. What you do is you open up the hierarchy and then you go into the cache object under utilities. And then for now, I'm just going to do internal. Normally I would do external files and I would export it to somewhere in my folder structure, but for now, for simplicity, I'll just have it cache as internal and I'll shorten the amount of frames to 24. And then I'll just hit build cache. Then if you scrub through, you'll see your cached animation. So now I'll show you the workflow for adding the system to an animated object. This is the default scene open here. If you click on the rig, first thing you need to make sure is when you're doing the animation on your object, pull it out of this spawn object slot. So I'm going to clear it out. And then another thing is I like to animate it in all object instead of the actual geometry. That way I can pull the geometry in and out of the animation. So I'll add the null, make sure they're in the same positions, and then we'll animate the null from, we'll go to here, go over here, rotate it, and I'll just change this to linear. So now we have the animated object. Let's say you're good with that and you want to now add the particles. Pull that out, make sure it's at the scene center, and then go ahead and drop this back into the spawn object. Then if I hit play, you can go ahead and dial in the look of your condensation. Let's say the look of the condensation is good with me. Next step is to go and cache it. So I'll go to the cache object. I'm going to set it to internal so it's stored in the file. And I'll hit build cache. Okay, now that that's cached, you can see it moving there. I'm just going to turn off the visibility of the emitters just so we're left with the geometry. And I'm also going to turn off materials so you can see it better. So if we go back to frame 0, you can then take this whole rig and stick that in your animated null. And then you'll be able to see the whole thing move as one piece. So now I'll show you how to render the system. This is the default scene. If I hit play, I'm just going to let it run through a few frames and so we get to somewhere where we can see some kinetic drops. Right now I have the drop generator enabled and also the mesher. Those are the two objects that are going to be used for rendering. The drop generator is going to be the static drops and the mesher will be rendered for the kinetic drops. So I'll pause it here. If I open this up, I'm just going to hide the emitters so we're just left with the geometry. I'm also going to turn off materials so we can see it. If you wanted to change these droplet sizes, well, not sizes, but the shape, those are under here. So these droplets are being populated across the particles. So if you wanted to change the shape of the particles, then you could just drop custom geometry under the generator here. So let me bring up a light. We'll do an area light. Just gonna set that as the camera so I can move it. Set it here. Add a camera. Let's see the render setting. The render settings are on physical. We'll just do progressive. So the droplets are showing up. We don't have a decent light in here, so let's just shrink this. Maybe turn it up. And then add one to the other side. So there you can see the drops showing up. You can add a black material to the cube, make it show up better. So that's how you render in the standard renderer. Now I can bring up the Redshift file and show you how to do it in Redshift. So here in Redshift, in the Redshift start file, I'll just again let it run for a bit, add more frames. So I'm just going to bring in, I'll create another black material for the cube so we can see the droplets better. And I'm also going to bring in a dome light. This automatically has an HDRI plugged in. So I'll bring up the render view. And there you can see the droplets. Now, this works a bit differently. So when you're in Redshift, and I think for Octane as well, but for that, when you're rendering in Redshift, you don't need the drop generator on. That's because on the static emitter, we have a Redshift tag, and then we're telling it to look at those droplets and then populate across the particles. And it's looking at these droplets here. Even though the drop generator is off, we're still using that geo in the tag here. That way it's rendered at render time and you don't have the geometry in the scene slowing it down. And then the kinetic mesher is still responsible for rendering the kinetic drops. So that's how you render in Redshift. Next I'll show you how to export the system out as an Alembic file so that you can use that in other software. So I'll open up the standard file again. If I turn off materials, we can see the droplets. So for exporting an Alembic, you're going to want the drop generator enabled, because then that'll generate geometry that you can then export. Also, you want the mesher enabled. So if I drop this down and go to the cache object, I'm going to set it to internal for now and just hit build cache, and that's going to cache everything out for me. So I have the scene cached. I'm just going to turn off the display of the emitters. That way you can just see the geometry. And what we're looking at here is the geo generator and the kinetic mesher. Those are the two objects that we're going to export for an Alembic. So highlight these two objects, go to export Alembic, set your frame range, enable selection only, that way only these two objects are exported, and then go ahead and click OK. And then wait for that to export. Okay, it's done exporting. I'm just gonna copy this cube into a new scene. And then we'll import the Alembic file. Make sure your frame rate is correct. Mine was set at 24. Scale is 1, and that's it. And there you have the geometry. So you could take these and you could send these to any other software that you need. So if you want to find the rig, you can go to samtato.com and go to store. There you'll find the rig and also some CAN models I have for sale.